Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Uh, Good afternoon and welcome to today's program on behalf of the Washington, D.C. Lawyer Chapter of the American Constitution Society. I would like to welcome you to Inspiration, Divergence, and Disappointment, Two Paths Towards Diversity in the Workplace. I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the At-Large Chapter, the Bay Area Lawyer Chapter, the Minneapolis-St. Paul Lawyer Chapter, and then, of course, this is being hosted by the Washington, D.C. Lawyer Chapter. Today, we have an excellent panel discussing a very timely matter. And so we're going to get right into it. In 2002, the firing of two Black head coaches, Tampa Bay Buccaneers Tony Dungy and Minnesota Vikings Dennis Green, left the NFL with just one Black head coach. In response to a study conducted afterwards by Johnny Cochran and Cyrus Mary, our panelists today, they criticized the NFL for not giving Black head coaches equal opportunities. The NFL implemented the so-called Rooney Rule. The Rooney Rule mandates that all NFL teams must interview ethnic minority candidates for coaching and front office positions. In March 2022, the Rooney Rule was extended to require that all NFL teams must employ a female or member of an ethnic or racial minority as an offensive assistant. Unfortunately, the Rooney Rule has not been as successful as some of us have hoped, and in February 2022, former Miami Dolphins head coach Brian Flores filed suit against the NFL, alleging that the 32 NFL teams continue to discriminate against Black coaches in the hiring process. Inspired by the NFL's Rooney Rule, the Mansfield Rule, named for the first woman admitted to the practice of law in the United States, was a winning idea at Diversity Lab's 2016 Women in Law Hackathon. The Mansfield Rule requires firms to implement systematic changes to processes and practices that broaden the slate of diverse talent considered for leadership and insert transparency into historically opaque talent processes. Among other things, it measures whether law firms have affirmatively considered at least 30% women, lawyers of color, LGBTQIA+ lawyers, and lawyers with disabilities for leadership roles, promotions, pathways to leadership, and senior level hiring. Since the Mansfield Rule's launch with more than 40 firms to now with more than 300 firms and 80 legal departments, Diversity Lab has worked with the participating firms to annually measure the outcomes and iterate the program based on those outcomes to ensure movement towards the goal of diversifying firm leadership as inclusively and impactfully as possible. Joining me today are experts on both the Rooney Rule and the Mansfield Rule. And I'm going to start with Cyrus. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what brings you here today?
Okay, well, hi, everybody. My name is Cyrus Mary. I'm the civil rights lawyer in Washington, D.C., co-founder of the law firm Mary & Scallett, as well as a consulting company, Working Ideal, and the not-for-profit Fritz Pollard Alliance, which has been kind of the champion of the Rooney Rule in the NFL community. Austin, do you want me to tell a little bit of the story behind it, or what?
We're going to come back to that. We're going to get into that in just a minute. We're going to go around so everyone knows who else it is, and then we're coming back to you. Lauren, do you want to go next and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren McCoy Coffey. I am an assistant professor of sport management, specializing in sport law at Winthrop University in Rock Hill, South Carolina. I am also the program director for our Sport and Fitness Administration graduate program. I am on this panel, I believe, because my research interests are in discrimination in professional and college sports. So kind of looking into how we have the discrimination issues and potentially what we can do legally to solve them or address them.
And I should say your work came to my attention because of the ABA Journal article in which you were quoted, which was addressing this issue on the Rooney Rule side. So we're thrilled to have you here today. Thank you. Kavita, I'm going to come to you next. You've given a little hint with your background. You want to introduce yourself and what your role is today?
Sure. So my name is Kavitha Ramakrishnan. I'm the Senior Director for Mansfield Rule and Knowledge Sharing at Diversity Lab. And I'm here because Diversity Lab is the entity that created the Mansfield Rule and has implemented it ever since. And so I'm here to talk about its evolution and why it works the way it does.
Wonderful. Thank you. And we're very excited to have you here. Rosa, I'm coming to you last, but you know you're my favorite. So give a little background on yourself and your role here.
No pressure, Austin, and so nice to see everyone here. My name is Rosa Nunez, and I lead diversity, equity, and inclusion at Foley Hoag, an amazing law firm, international and national, and I'm based out of Boston. And I believe Austin invited me here because as a practitioner, I've been in the weeds with the Mansfield Rule for a few years now, and I know that he will love to hear my perspective.
Absolutely. So excited to have you here. All right. So thank you everybody for being here. Really excited about this. Cyrus, let's jump into it. Take us back to 2002, the study that you conducted and you worked on. What was happening at that time with the NFL around hiring Black coaches? How did the Rooney Rule come into place, and what was the reception like?
Sure. Well, it was Martin Luther King Day in 2002, and I started my day like I normally do, reading the sports section. And as a civil rights attorney and an NFL fan, I was deeply upset that Coach Tony Dungy was fired from Tampa Bay. And previously, Dennis Green was the head coach of the Vikings, fired a week or two earlier. And these are two like legendary, extraordinary head coaches. And I felt like something could be done about it. And that led me to working with Johnny Cochran and a labor economist named Dr. Janice Madden from University of Pennsylvania, and putting together a study called Black Coaches in the NFL, Superior Performance, Inferior Opportunities, using statistical analysis as well as anecdotes like we would do in one of our cases, bringing the statistics to life. And what they showed was there was a double standard, that the Black head coaches were held to a much higher standard, that the few that had the opportunities won more games, significantly more games, went to the playoffs 2 out of 3 times versus 1 out of 3 for white coaches, and were overall very successful, yet had, last hired, first fired. And so, but we had to have a solution in that report. And that was really inspired by one of the landmark cases I had done with Coca-Cola, where we required, and there's a landmark race case, that there was a cohort of Black executives, but they weren't breaking the glass ceiling there. And so the way to do that, we said, was have a diverse slate of candidates when there are significant positions being open, to at least be in the process to be considered, so you overcome the kind of tap on the shoulder approach that corporate America is known for. And that idea was inspired by an article I read about Colin Powell, who the Secretary of the Army back in the Carter years was given a list of colonels on the way to generals, and there wasn't a single person of color there. And he said, well, wait a minute, go back and do your homework. And when they came back, they added Colin Powell to the list. He becomes a general and one of the most significant military leaders of the last century, only because he was given consideration. And so my thought was, if we could just do that, whether it's Coca-Cola or the NFL or any other form, to get people into the process, that would lead to good results. And in fact, it did lead to great results. That we at one point had the first several years, 10 or 15 years of the Rooney Rule were a big success. There were at 1.8 coaches of color, head coaches of color, 6 or 7 general managers. There were 10 Super Bowl teams, starting with Coach Dungy of the Colts and Lovie Smith with the Bears, that were led by a person of color as head coach or general manager. So I think it really exemplified the power of diversity. I think the issues that we've had in recent years has shown some backsliding, and I think that's part of the challenge of today. There are currently 6 coaches of color, head coaches of color in the NFL, a record number of general managers, a record number of club presidents of color. So there is a good amount of progress, yet we still see many examples that are inexplicable in decision-making and equal opportunity being denied. So it's the way I look at the NFL, it's both a bellwether of the country and a mirror of the country. And so I'll just stop there. There's much more we could say.
Absolutely. So just to kind of dig down a little bit in terms of practicality, like how was it actually practically implemented? What was actually specifically required? And then were there any enforcement mechanisms or penalties for failing to adhere?
So we advocated for a diverse slate. What the NFL adopted with the leadership of Dan Rooney, the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and this is back in 2002, that the clubs would commit to interviewing at least one head coach of color or one minority head coach before selecting the head coach. So just get somebody in the process, open your mind a little bit. Immediately there was things went off track. The owner of the Dallas Cowboys, Jerry Jones, interviewed for 2 days in person a white head coach. Bill Parcells was a legendary coach, and had like a 20-minute phone call with African-American coach Dennis Green. And we were like, wait a minute, that's not what we met. We met in person with the decision makers, and we eventually got that change. Then there was one club, the Detroit Lions, where the general manager made a decision to hire a white head coach, but then he wanted Black candidates to come in even though he had made that decision. And we're like, none of the Black candidates went. They're like, why am I going to go waste my time if it's not really an opening? And so we told the league that this is a signature moment. And by then we were creating what became the Fritz Pollard Alliance. And, I was there with Hall of Famers like Kellen Winslow and Johnny Cochran and others. And we just said, this is a signature moment. You have to enforce this or it's meaningless. And thankfully, they agreed with us, and they gave what was then the largest fine in NFL history against the general manager of the Detroit Lions. That was a moment of accountability. But there was also a soft type of accountability that really led to tremendous progress over a period of years, which was the fact that the most influential owner in that time period, let's say from like 2003 to the mid 2010s, was Dan Rooney, the owner of the Steelers. So I think that kind of soft leadership behind the scenes, plus the good work that the Fritz Pollard Alliance did working on developing candidates and making sure great candidates were presented to decision makers for every position, the NFL head coach to other coaching, general manager to scouting positions, that process led to a great moment of success. And, all reform movements have a shelf life, and it really kind of progressed tremendously. But then the last 5 years, things went downward when another moment of accountability happened, when there was at least in my judgment, a blatant violation by the owner of the Oakland Raiders, who didn't interview a person of color in the process, and yet selected a white head coach, John Gruden, who was later left in kind of a disgrace. But the owner didn't interview candidates of color. And we said, hey, league, you got to put the hammer down. And they didn't. And I think that sent a negative message of accountability that they didn't care about this as much anymore. So I do think for reform efforts to succeed, they're very fragile, and they take a lot of different pieces to them to sustain. And I think that sent a negative message. And then, we had inexplicable decisions also in the last 5 years that are hard to defend. And that's, what led to the Brian Flores lawsuit.
Well, taking that as a moment to pivot, Lauren, let's bring you into the conversation now. 20 years after the Rooney Rule was implemented, Brian Flores is currently in active litigation against the NFL and 3 specific teams in which he alleges that the league is, quote, rife with racism. As an outside observer of the NFL, what happened to the Rooney Rule that started with such great promise and with such great initial success? And is there more that should be done now to kind of revitalize this to try and get back to that success that it had previously?
So kind of just to dovetail off of Cyrus's point, what happened is the original architects and those supporters of the Rooney Rule are no longer the team owners in charge in a lot of instances. And since that's the case, it's kind of pushed to create some of these concerns and these issues, because there is, this kind of change that's associated with it. So the University of Central Florida has a group called the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport that does a racial and gender report card every year to talk about kind of where we're progressing with the NCAA, as well as all of the different professional sports leagues. And to receive an A+ on that report card, you need to have at least 30% minority population, because they do that to reflect what our actual society looks like. Right now, in terms of just overall grade, the NFL for their 2022 report card got about a B, but there are areas where you can see that there is growth. For example, in terms of the league-wide initiatives, they received an A+ because there are currently 6 different diversity league-wide initiatives that are allowing this to happen. Not only that, for gender, for example, to receive an A+, you need to have 45% or more. The league offices in New York received that A+ because there is a lot of, change when it comes to how things are progressing in the league offices. Where we're seeing the problem is with owners who have essentially made up their minds as to who they want to hire before they go through the decision. And the Rooney Rule is basically being kind of used as a placeholder or a check mark box. But it's a good thing that we have it, because it is allowing some of these owners to get kind of some public ridicule that might change how they proceed with these things. The best example of this right now is the Houston Texans. They are currently on their 3rd Black head coach in 3 years. So it looks like they're bringing Black coaches in because they're being prompted to do so, and then quickly firing them. However, in connection with that, they were interested, or at least the rumor mill said they were interested, in hiring Josh McCown, who is a former NFL quarterback who at the time was only coaching high school, and they were going to bring him in as the head coach of an NFL team versus, some of these other guys who've been there for years. So it was one of those things that makes people question and say, hey, what's going on here? And ultimately they ended up hiring D'Amico Ryans, who is a Black man as well. So, we'll see how he does with this next year, and hopefully they're not looking to hire their 4th coach in 4 years, because ultimately there's going to be some issues there. But we are seeing growth, at least in terms of the number of assistant coaches, because the NFL did receive an A+ on their minority ratings for assistant coaches, but we're not seeing them progress up to the next level.
And something you mentioned is this kind of goes beyond coaches. I know that a lot of the focus is on coaches, but there has been progress in the front office, and it's good to hear that, and we're glad to hear that. But there's the issue of the ownership, right? There are currently no Black majority owners in the NFL. How much is this the problem that the Rooney Rule is intended to address, kind of a systemic problem that goes beyond just like who are the coaches or who are in the front office? And really, like, the NFL can't necessarily dictate who the owners are. But if all of your owners are white, that seems like it's going to have consequences when they go to make hiring decisions.
I would say that's not as much of an issue, simply because we had all white ownership when we had, the 8 Black head coaches or minority head coaches before. So we have seen progress with a, white based ownership. It's just the issue is more of a familiarity. So for example, when I was in college, I did an honors thesis working with Bill Walsh, looking at the lack of minority coaches in college football. And it's the same issue happening there too, as well, where essentially what we learned through that research is that the reason why we had such a growth of minority coaches during that time period, so within the last 20 years, that peak that we hit, was because there was a lot more visibility in terms of assistant coaches, so that way you saw owners knowing these individuals. So we had like a key group of people that a lot of them started at a coaching program with Bill Walsh when he was at the Raiders, and it kind of expanded from there. So we do have the opportunity for growth, but another kind of problem that persists within this is that, unfortunately, a lot of the times, as shown by the Houston Texans, minority coaches get the opportunity when it is a no-win situation. So, it's the owner has either already made up their mind as to who they want to hire, or, the situation is so bad that no one else wants to take that job. For here in the Carolinas, the great example of that is what just happened with Steve Wilkes. He took over the team, did a great job, and people were surprised that he didn't get the head coaching job, and they brought in Frank Reich, who was fired from Indianapolis. So you have someone who's actually working successfully with the team, but it was pretty clear the owner had who he wanted in mind already. So that's kind of where we're running into the issue, is just how do we get those owners to think outside of the box at this point?
Yeah. I mentioned in the intro that the Rooney Rule has now expanded to require the employment of a female or member of an ethnic or racial minority as an offensive assistant. So now we're reaching down into the assistants and not just the head coach. Do you expect this new requirement will have a positive impact? Do you think that we're going to see more women coaching on the sidelines in the NFL?
I would say yes, because we are, currently there are, I believe, 6 women who are coaching with various teams in very like front facing roles, not just behind the scenes sort of roles. So we are seeing more of that visibility that's happening with that. And that's something that's beneficial, especially in the last 2 Super Bowl teams. I believe there was at least one female assistant on at least one of the 2 teams. So we're seeing a lot of visibility, and we have seen a lot of success with the Rooney Rule, as I mentioned previously, when it comes to assistant coaches. So it seems that there's more willingness to kind of branch out and try new things in those areas that aren't as visible. So I do think that we can have a positive impact with the Rooney Rule there. It's just a matter of, how do we get that Rooney Rule to help us to that next step to when it comes to visibility as well.
All right. A little note of optimism there. Hopefully good things. All right. We're going to switch gears here a little bit. We're going to switch over to law firms, 2 organizations that maybe don't always seem like they would be natural fits to be providing inspiration. But Kavita, let's turn to the Mansfield Rule, which is inspired by the Rooney Rule. But let's back up a minute. What is the Women in Law Hackathon, and how did the Mansfield Rule come out of the 2016 version?
So the Women in Law Hackathon was an event that Diversity Lab held in 2016 at Stanford Law School. And the idea was to generate ideas that Diversity Lab could actually implement and test for advancing women in law firms. As some of you might know, women enter law firms as first years at generally the same rate as men, but the number drops as you advance within the law firm. And certainly women are very much underrepresented in leadership at law firms. So over the course of the 6 months in 2016, more than 50 law firm partners, law students, and advisors collaborated in teams to brainstorm practical solutions for advancing and retaining more experienced women lawyers at law firms. And at the end of the 6 months, we held a pitch event, and each team presented their ideas in person to a panel of judges. And the Mansfield Rule was one of the winning ideas that came out of that event. And the concept that was pitched was inspired by the Rooney Rule. The idea was that firms would be asked to consider at least one woman candidate for high-level law firm positions. So over the next year, Diversity Lab took that concept and turned it into a workable framework that we could partner with law firms on testing. We expanded the pool of lawyers that the initiative was intended to benefit to include not just women, but also lawyers from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, since we know that people in that demographic are also very much underrepresented in law firm leadership. We took the idea of interviewing just one person from an underrepresented background and expanded that out to a 30% of the candidate pool requirement. And the reason we did that is because research shows that 30% is the critical mass needed for candidate pool to disrupt biases and lead to the selection of someone who might otherwise be quote unquote tokenized. And we also added a knowledge sharing component where we're asking, we want firms to basically work together collectively and build on each other's knowledge. So no one's really recreating the wheel on anything. And we're really moving the needle on DEI as a legal profession more broadly. And we also added some outside accountability. We wanted to make sure that we as Diversity Lab were actually checking in with firms and holding them accountable for actually meeting the Mansfield goals. So in 2017, we launched Mansfield in partnership with more than 40 law firms that participated in that initial hackathon. And we set a limited time frame of just 1 year for Mansfield, where we were asking firms to reach certain DEI goals within that time period. And that period was important for a few reasons. First, research shows that people are more likely to reach goals if they're specific, measurable, and time-bound. And secondly, from its inception, we knew that the Mansfield Rule would be an experiment. The name of our company is Diversity Lab because we're all about testing, experimenting, and iterating. And we knew that Mansfield would need to evolve and change over time. And we wanted to make sure we incorporated that ability to change into Mansfield. So at the end of the 1 year period, we want to have the chance to look back, see what worked, what didn't work, and then to iterate Mansfield to make sure that it was effective and actually meeting the goals that we wanted it to meet. So we found that this initiative and its underlying principles resonated with the participating firms, and including firms that weren't necessarily participating at the time. And since then, we've launched Mansfield versions that are tailored to the specific structures of mid-sized firms, legal departments, UK firms. As you noted, we now have more than 300 law firms and more than 80 legal departments participating.
So, I mean, that's incredible growth in just a short period of time. I'm curious, like, what were the major challenges you faced when you were first launching Mansfield, and what are the challenges that law firms encounter from your perspective when they first come to join? I mean, you've added, you're more than 5x, you're almost at 10x the number of starties. These new folks who are coming and joining, what's the initial hurdles that they face when they first try to join the program?
So when they first join, I think it's, firms come in with different levels of processes in place to actually track and document their underrepresented population. So I think it really runs the gamut in terms of, there's some firms that have very robust programs in place for their underrepresented groups. There are certain firms that don't have anything in place. And really, I think the challenge for firms initially is making sure that they understand, first of all, what is the purpose of Mansfield? We're trying to boost diversity in law firm leadership by implementing systemic processes that would allow people to broaden candidate pools, trying to increase transparency regarding leadership processes, what it takes to be a leader, things that impact leadership like compensation. We're trying to do all of these things. I think being able to communicate that internally, what exactly the goal is, to make sure that everybody at the firm is on board regarding reaching these goals, because this isn't just here's an initiative that we just want our DEI department to be working on. Ultimately, Mansfield is about getting leadership involved, about getting your marketing department involved, HR. Everybody has to be involved in Mansfield. And I think on top of making sure that you have processes in place to determine who within your firm is underrepresented, making sure that all parts of the firm are working together to make sure that these processes are deeply embedded into the law firm's systems, I think really is the most difficult portion for, I think, both firms that are joining as well as firms that are continuing, making sure to maintain that over time as well.
Yeah, and talking about continuing, you're currently on version 6.0 of the Mansfield Rule. Mm-hmm. You've been iterating and growing and developing. What are the big challenges that you're still facing? And then how do you continue to grow at the incredible rate and bring in even more firms into this program?
So I'd say, the challenge with Mansfield being iterative means that it can be very hard to define what exactly is Mansfield. So, we started with the women, and we came out of the Women in Law Hackathon, and I think that's where most people know us, is from that Women in Law Hackathon. But we've now evolved it to include underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities. We've included LGBTQ plus folks. We're now have a strong focus as well as lawyers with disabilities. So even in the fact that we were inspired by the Rooney Rule conceptually, People assume that this is just about hiring, but really this is also all about all aspects of the talent cycle. We're asking firms to look at promotions, look at the way work is allocated in terms of pitches. We're also asking firms more recently to look at succession planning, at their compensation policies, making sure that's transparent, accessible to both partners and associates. So it's taken on a larger, a more robust focus on all areas of the talent cycle. So I think trying to explain what Mansfield is, the fact that we're trying to broaden the implement processes that broaden people that are considered for leadership and things like that, that can be difficult to explain to people. And then in terms of growth, I think actually our focus is less on let's see how many people we can get to join Mansfield, and more on how do we keep this movement going long term. How do we make sure that people that are that join Mansfield, and it's for us, it's really important that Mansfield is voluntary. People are doing this because they want to, and that they're recommitting to goals year over year, and recommitting to the new goals that we set year over year in order to continue moving the needle on DEI. We want to make sure that people continue that progress, that they take the next step forward and the next step forward and continue moving from where they are. And so that we're moving forward as an industry and hopefully have better outcomes, 10, 15 years from now.
Great. I realized at the top I did not reveal my own conflict. So I am an attorney at Foley Hoag. So Rosa, I'm going to turn to you now. You have successfully led our law firm through several rounds of the Mansfield certification process and are currently going through the process for 6.0 certification. From your perspective, why is it important for a law firm to be Mansfield certified, and what more can and should be done?
Well, thank you, Austin. This has been just such a wonderful conversation to be listening in. So we are currently trying to achieve 6.0, and there's a lot of work involving that. We came into the game originally a little bit late, so we completed certification 4.0 in 2020. Then we signed back on and accomplished 5.0, and this time plus, which means that we did not only consider some of the categories, but we actually hired people and promoted people into the roles, right? It was like a different layer of accountability and success, and we're very proud of that. And because of how much progress we have seen in the past few years at Foley Hoag, not only in the diversity of our senior roles, governance roles within the firm, but in the success that we're seeing with changing mindsets and behaviors, we decided to move on and continue on with 6.0. And for us, I think that has been the most critical aspect. We have been really intentional about tracking and measuring and intentionality around our practices with DE&I. But when you start having a conversation where people in the room are achieving the same goal, want to achieve the same goal, you drive change with behaviors and mindsets, and bringing everyone together, leadership teams together. Like Kavita mentioned, we work together. We have a task force at Foley Hoag, and we meet every month, and we go through our process. Where are we with this requirement of the Mansfield certification? What is HR doing with job descriptions, for example? How are we doing with recruiting? How are we doing with BD and pitches? And we have everyone in the room working together to achieve a common goal. I mean, a lot of the conversations have shifted in the past 2.5 years. People are talking about the Mansfield. What if we don't even really, how do we, if we don't do this, we're not going to be in compliance, right? So it's beyond the check a box right now. I think it creates a sentiment of, we are united to accomplish a goal that is the best thing to do, right? The right thing to do. But ultimately, it's just changing the way that the business is run, it's changing mindsets, it's breaking down barriers and providing a lot more opportunities for conversations on how can we be a better workplace for everyone. I can share a little bit more about that later, Austin.
Great. And I mean, you mentioned the fact that part of this is just kind of doing the right thing, but what is it that the Mansfield certification kind of allows law firms to do that would be more difficult or maybe even impossible for them to do without the certification process? What does this give them in terms of another tool?
I think it's the fact that you have to, like, if you sign up for the Mansfield Rule, you are committed to doing something, right? It's a commitment that you have measures and requirements, and you have different levels of accountability. And it's not just the D&I department driving this. Like I said, you involve your MPs, you involve your HR folks, you involve your marketing folks. And when you're working together, like, recording and measuring and being accountable for something is very, very, very different than saying, well, we care about this, but Rosa will do it, and not being involved in the journey. So bringing everyone together, working on this common goal, it just creates a different level of ownership that you wouldn't have if you were just tracking and just going with the flow and seeing what happens, you know, and yay, let's see, we really care about D&I, but no one is really intentional about it. It's just that adding a different layer, a separate layer of, if we really want to achieve this, we have to work on it together and everyone is responsible.
What have been some of the biggest hurdles you have faced, both internally in terms of getting support within the firm, but then also externally in terms of how people outside the firm view the effort or view the Mansfield certification?
Yeah. So for us, I mean, like I mentioned, it's been very successful because we're doing it, I believe, I want to say that we're doing it the right way. We use it as a guide. We use it as a tool. We actually expanded internally because Mansfield tracks for certification purposes only senior levels and mid-level associates, for example, joining the firm. We track it all the way to the entry level because we're changing mindsets and behaviors, right? So we think that it's been a great tool for us. Now, externally, there's mixed feelings and criticism, right? A lot of the clients want to see Mansfield certified firms because clients more now than ever want to do business with firms that share their same values and that they have the same focus and emphasis on D&I. So there's noises around firms just, you know, using, for example, white women to get certified. As right, like, what's the low hanging fruit? How can we get just this certification so we can compete in the marketplace? But I would say that those are fewer cases, because what I know is that many firms are using the tools in the right way to drive change. And it's not all that we do. It's not all about the tracking, and it's not all about, you know, the meeting the requirements, but it's about ingraining and changing the mindsets and behaviors that law firms have been operating under for more than 100 years, right? And that takes some intentionality, and this tool has really helped bringing people together, having the conversations that haven't had in the past, and trying to drive change in a consistent way across the industry.
Great. And have you seen positive impacts from the Mansfield Rule, not just at our firm, which obviously I think you and I both agree that we've seen some great impacts at Foley, but more broadly kind of across the legal industry? Have you seen this actually changing people's views and having a positive impact?
1000%. I think it is just like we're having this conversation here. Over 300 law firms are having these conversations, and it's just raising the awareness around, you know, how an industry that is so far behind in the space, right? What are the things that we can do as an industry to continue to provide access, to continue to elevate people and open our doors that historically have been closed to folks that look like myself, right? So bringing minds together, like we're competitors, my peer firms, and we come together in these sharing calls that Kavita mentioned, and we share like, hey, what's going on? How are you doing? Like, how are you tracking this? What are you doing that is working? It is giving us an opportunity to collaborate in the spaces that we haven't had before. And I think eventually, with more intention and more firms behind it, and firms using it the right way, right? I think we can ultimately drive change in the industry that is way overdue.
The antitrust attorney in me can't help myself but say that the meetings that are taking place are completely in compliance
Yes,
with antitrust laws, and
very
there's no
much.
inappropriate discussions about
No.
hiring practices or anything. But all jokes aside, I mean, if the statistics are a little bit hard to get your hands on, but we still see diversity problems at law firms. We still see issues, especially if we talk about senior leadership, equity partnership, that kind of thing. There's still problems. So, I mean, the program is great. It's obviously expanding, but what do you see as the biggest challenges and hurdles still facing the legal industry to kind of move those numbers and to really have that diversity represented, not just in people's values, but also in terms of actual results?
No, and the struggle is real, Austin. And I would tell you there's a lot of resistance to change in some spaces. There's a lot of falling back to the old ways of doing things. You have an industry, like I mentioned, that has been very slow to catch on DE&I. We're just waking up. There's a lot of efforts happening in the industry, but they're probably 15-year-old or less. So historically, there hasn't been an effort and an emphasis. So the senior levels of the firm, mid senior level attorneys, partners of color, is non-existent because the access was not there. So we're doing a lot better in attracting diversity into the
We're going to hope that we get Rosa back, but it looks like she froze. So I'm going to take this moment. We've got a little over 15 minutes left. If folks in the audience have questions, please put them into the Q&A. We are happy to try and address any questions you may have. I was hoping that would be long enough to stall for Rosa to rejoin us, but it hasn't happened yet. All right, so I will switch gears here, and we're going to go back to some more questions. And I'm going to start with a question that's maybe a little unfair to everyone, but I've got a question from the discussion today that wasn't something we talked about before. But one of the things that I heard that struck me as being very interesting difference between the Mansfield Rule and the Rooney Rule, despite them having the inspirations from each other. The Mansfield Rule is voluntary. You can choose whether you want to participate. The Rooney Rule is not voluntary. It is mandated by the NFL, obviously different leadership and authority structures here. But I'm curious, Cyrus and Lauren, from your perspective, what would be the impact if the NFL said, we're going to make this voluntary, you can decide whether you want to participate in the Rooney Rule or not, and maybe go down that line of, if you participate, we're going to continually ratchet up expectations. But if you don't want to participate, you can be out there as being publicly not participating. Do you think that would have an impact? And for the organizations?
I think if it wasn't a mandated rule, it would be a complete disaster, because you got to remember what we're up against. We're up against in-group favoritism. Literally, I don't want to say which owner, one owner in the recent hire said, we hired this guy, white guy, because he reminded me of myself. Well, that's like, okay, thank you. You just articulated the in-group favoritism that we're up against. You're up against kind of a laser beam, we're going to get, I have my person, I'm just going to do that. And the whole point about it is casting a wide net and to break through some of the barriers. And there is literature, scientific literature, that supports the impact of this. So for example, the Harvard Business Journal did a study in 2016 that said if you have multiple minority candidates, and that's something we did get the NFL to adopt. Now it's multiple candidates of color for the head coach position. That the chances of being hired goes up like 190 times. And let's also not lose sight of the big picture here. The big picture is not just to do this because it's the right thing to do. You do this because in the NFL world, you want to win championships, you want to win Super Bowls, and the power of diversity, throughout your ranks will help you get there. In the business community, it leads to innovation, scientific breakthroughs by having more diversity of thought and diversity of backgrounds. You're going to make more mistakes if you don't have different perspectives. I know running a law firm and the decisions we make, I'd really like to have a lot of different points of view. Well, if you have same people with the same kind of backgrounds, you're going to lose that ability. So, and then there's the final piece to it, which is not just the morally right thing to do and the business innovations reasons to do it, to embrace diversity and inclusion. But look, let's be honest, we're in a moment in our history where there internationally and at home, there's a real debate about democracy versus autocracy. And I think the only way we can, well, one way to strengthen our democracy is to really be a country that's about inclusion, that is really both economically, business, politically, every kind of way. Because if we stand for and really live up to our equal opportunity principles, we'll be a stronger country while we're dealing with this, rise of autocracy that we seem to be facing right now.
Lauren, you agree?
Yeah, 100%. We have owners right now, even with a mandate, who are trying to do things to get around the rule. And while there have been innovators, Art Davis comes to mind when it comes to these things. When we see kind of, where he wanted things to come through and was really, he had one of the first African-American head coaches, had one of the first, highest ranking female employees in the NFL. So there are people who are willing to, strive for diversity, but sometimes they need a little bit of a push to get there, to see and recognize these different individuals and know that they have the ability to be successful. Because, where we are right now with the Rooney Rule is because it was mandated. And now we're starting to see how it can expand to other areas, because unfortunately football is very much, that boys club. And as a result, it's going to be harder for them to push these things to happen. It's not as hard with other leagues because, basketball has their, a women's focus as well. So does hockey. So football really is the only sport where women aren't directly having their own equivalent as, league. And because of that, we don't think of women as, or women being in that role. So we need things like the Rooney Rule to push those things forward for them as well.
All right, Kavita, so on the other side, the Mansfield Rule obviously is voluntary. What do you think the impact would be? I've got some ideas of who the authority that can put it in. I can't quite imagine it actually being implemented, but if the ABA or a bar association, a state bar association, or some other organization were to mandate the Mansfield Rule compliance for law firms, would it work?
It's a great question. I mean, I think from in my view, the fact that Mansfield Rule is voluntary is a huge benefit, I think, of it. We're not just asking that they, join and now you're in Mansfield Rule and you're in it for the long haul. We're asking firms to look at the requirements that we set year over year, the more difficult goals we're setting the following year. Look at this again. Do you still want to continue working towards these goals? So they're affirmatively recommitting year over year to goals. They can stop at any time if they want to. But the fact that they're actually saying, yes, I want to do it, means I think that they'll put even more effort into actually reaching those goals. And there is a sense of, FOMO that ends up creating is you have a bunch of firms that started, when we did the pilot, we had 40 firms that were doing this. And then continuing to do it the following year. And then other firms were looking at this and saying, wait, maybe I should be doing this too. And so I think that's the fact that we've grown demonstrates that this has at least had some larger impact, even though it's voluntary. I mean, if it was mandatory, I think that then there's also you run the risk of people doing it for finding loopholes, going around, trying to find ways to meet the letter of the law without actually meeting the spirit of what's actually trying to happen here. So I think the benefit of having it be voluntary is the idea that you're more likely to have a majority of the people involved doing this in a way where they're actually trying to make change.
Yeah. So one thing that struck me as I was preparing for this is that, it's fascinating to think that the NFL inspired the legal industry to engage in this kind of thing. And Cyrus, you mentioned at the top that part of your inspiration actually came from the military and something that had happened there.
Yeah.
So, we're talking three industries that you wouldn't necessarily see as, taking best practices from each other. But is there something special about the NFL, the legal practice, perhaps also the military? Is there something about the hierarchy that we see in these industries that kind of lends itself to these kind of programs? Or is it just this kind of program should and could be implemented in just about any industry? And I'll open that up to anybody.
Well, in terms of the use of diverse slates, we've been advocating, my law firm and our consulting company, Working Ideal. We've been advocating that across industries. We've had universities use variations of it. We've had different companies and different kinds of industries. I mean, it's all it is just standing for fair competition and opening up the process a little bit and not rushing and being more deliberative. So I think that reform can go across literally any industry. Is there something between law, NFL, and military? Yeah, I think they're very hierarchical organizations, and that's one of the challenges. I mean, I noticed that when I was a first-year associate, like everybody's, you look up the, who's the name on the door and this and that. Now I'm the name on the door, and I try everything I can to kind of flatten the hierarchy, But I think there is a tendency of hierarchical way of looking at the world. And I think that's part of the reasons why we need interventions. I do think the highest profile job in America, more than a CEO job, is head coach of an NFL team. And I try to remind people that, less than somewhere around 1% or less of CEOs of major companies in the country are African-American or people of color, just so few. And look at the numbers for big law firms, the people of color that are partners, the numbers are really tiny. So we're up against it as a country to really create change. But I heard the word intentionality used a lot of times on this program, and that's what it's going to take. It's going to take intentionality. It's going to take thoughtful ideas, consistent effort. If you take the foot off the pedal just a little bit, you'll plummet downward. What I like hearing about the Mansfield Rule is that it's like an annual, hey, we're going to keep on track and check in every year. I think that kind of constant effort is what it's going to take.
Lauren or Kavita?
Yeah, I would say that it is that intentionality. And if there's one thing that's kind of common that's happening with all of these organizations now, is there is public questioning of having that lack of diversity. And that's really what's kind of pushing a lot of these efforts, is because for so long we've just accepted that, that's how it is. And now we have this pushback to say, wait a minute, does it actually have to be like that?
Right.
And the more that we have that pushback, that's what's creating the need for these programs. So as we've evolved as a society, we're going to see more of this innovation. And eventually, I hope, one day we'll reach the point where we don't have to necessarily think about it, and the diversity will just be that commonplace. But right now, we still need to push and question.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the idea of being more intentional and thoughtful about who we're considering for important leadership roles and other influential positions is something that crosses industries and absolutely can benefit any type of industry. I mean, there might be differences in how it's implemented or who needs to benefit more than others. Who's being underrepresented in various fields, but the general principles absolutely apply.
All right, I think we're just about to our last question. Unfortunately, I got an email from Rosa. She's not going to be able to rejoin us. They're having some power problems up in Boston right now. Last question, and this is admittedly a bit of a, let's stretch and go beyond our area of expertise. But in discussions of diversity and leadership, there's often a concern that there, quote, aren't enough candidates in the pipeline. In the legal industry, the pipeline obviously flows from law schools with head coaches, you would think that it would flow naturally from assistant coaches and other lower level coaches, coaches at college levels. Perhaps it flows from high school coaches. That seems like a bit of a stretch to go reach down into a high school coach, but by the time people are headed to law school, or by the time they get their first coaching position, assistant coaching position in the NFL or a head coaching in college, they've already faced a lifetime of difficulties. And I'm curious, from your perspective, are there things that law firms or NFL teams or whoever it is who's trying to address this problem of the pipeline that they could be doing outside of their own hiring decisions to kind of help feed that pipeline and help make sure that when those candidates get to them, there's enough there that they are getting that diverse slate that they're looking for? Kavita, I'll start with you and we'll go back the opposite way.
Sure. So I think what's interesting, at least in the legal field, is that there absolutely is a pipeline issue for sure. The issue, I think, more than the reason Mansfield is focused on leadership is that even the limited diversity that you find at lower levels doesn't necessarily trickle up. So it gets worse and worse and worse as you get more and more senior. Which is why Mansfield's focused on leadership. But there are definitely things that we found that firms and leaders and legal departments do to broaden pipelines. And I think the one that seems to be the most popular is law firms and departments, legal departments partnering with law schools or undergraduate institutions or even high schools. And with the aim to provide students with exposure to the practice of law. A lot of people don't even think to go into the practice of law if they don't know someone who's already in the field. They just know what they see on TV, and TV makes it look a lot more daunting than it might be to someone who might actually have the desire and skill set to make it. So it really makes the legal profession more accessible to people that might not consider even pursuing that field, just by partnering with students, letting them know this is what it's a day-to-day life of a lawyer looks like. That can make all the difference, and then providing that level of mentorship as they try to go through that process as well.
Great. Lauren, I'm especially thinking of if we're hiring more women coaches into the NFL, how do we get more women interested in being a football coach and filling that pipeline, or any of the other difficulties of getting people ready to kind of take on those roles?
Sure. So speaking as a woman who has worked in the sport industry, sometimes it's difficult because there is like this unspoken test that you have to take. And for example, I worked in baseball and basketball, which was admittedly easier than football. So I think that you see some of those areas where you have some of those changes where I think football could learn a lot from basketball, because for basketball, for example, while they do have majority white ownership, they don't have this problem when it comes to, diversity with coaching. And a lot of it is because their coaches come from the playing ranks. And while that still happens with the NFL, the problem is that coaches come oftentimes from, offensive players, whereas you have majority or the line roles versus, your wide receivers, et cetera. So the areas where you have majority Black players, you don't see the push to make those individuals into that kind of that coaching rank. So that's part of the attitude shift that we need to see. And honestly, we're starting to see some of that shift with players, because in the past, just recent NFL draft, the top 3 quarterbacks that were taken were Black, so we are starting to see some of those shifts and changes where it could be that, given it a couple of years, the pipeline is there. It just needs to have the people there, and we're starting to finally put the people in the right spots. But yeah, you also have the diversity initiatives with the league. They're doing a lot with HBCUs to make sure that we can bring minorities in and get them where they need to go in football.
All right. Cyrus, thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, well, Austin's a great question. You have to look not only at the coveted position, but what are the pipelines? And that's NFL or the companies we consult with or do programmatic relief with. With the NFL, it's really easy to simplify it. There's like 3 pipelines. College coaching, there's never been a Black head coach go from the college ranks as a head coach directly to head coach in the NFL. That hasn't happened. Then there's defensive coordinator. Those positions have a healthy number of coaches of color, and that pipeline has succeeded into head coach, like D'Amico Ryan said, Lauren talked about for the Houston Texans. However, the fad and the focus of owners has been on offensive coordinator. And that's where there's been an underrepresentation of coaches of color. That is a legacy of discrimination by position when there was virtually no Black quarterbacks. And that went on for decades. And then that got chipped away at starting in the 70s with Shaq Harris. And, you know, we had Warren Moon and Doug Williams, all these gentlemen break barriers. But if you look at, for example, the Carolina hiring, they hired Frank Reich, who was a backup quarterback. And there are a lot of white backup quarterbacks who become coaches, but there have been very few Black backup quarterbacks. And then for a long time, not able to star as a starter. So that legacy has hurt the NFL's journey. And that's why with the prodding of the Fritz Pollard Alliance, there was this effort or movement to make sure there's assistant coaches on the offensive side who are people of color or women at the lowest levels and work their way up. I would point to Jennifer King, who's an African-American woman running backs coach with the Washington Commanders. Jobs like that is going to help feed the pipeline. And so I think the pipeline is a key part of this. When we came in to create the Rooney Rule, which is about leveling the playing field, we were really standing on the shoulders of the great work that Bill Walsh, the former head coach of the 49ers, who started this minority internship program to build up a pipeline. But we have to keep focusing on the pipeline and on finding ways to level the playing field.
Well, I think that's a great way to end it. Keep focusing on the pipeline and keep looking for ways to level the playing field. I want to thank my panelists today. You guys were fantastic. This was a fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, this is a discussion that's going to be going on for years and years. So we can do a follow-up next year and probably the year after and every year after for a long time. But so glad to hear that you guys are working on this and thinking about it and helping to move the ball forward. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. On behalf of the Washington, D.C. Lawyer Chapter of the American Constitution Society and our co-sponsors, thank you very much, both to the panelists and to the audience for attending today. For those of you who are in D.C. or thinking about D.C., we hope that you will join us at the National Convention next week. Otherwise, with that, thank you, take care, have a great day.